friend suggested I share my story here, and I finally have the time to type it out. I don't know if this exactly meets the standards of this outlet, but it definitely is the scariest experience I've ever had. Here goes. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As I now am 21 and live in a bustling city in Alberta, I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while. But it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child and my father worked in another province months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late-night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forests. This night I was exploring said woods. I usually never went too far in, usually up to a large rock formation I like to climb and look out through the trees in all direction. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I suddenly started hearing a sound from further in, a sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying, faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared since crying was the last thing I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to help, but then I worried that the girl would wander further in beyond earshot. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was in. It definitely wasn't easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to even make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all of this was how consistent this crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind. Just nonstop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that had only a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A gray tape recorder, one of the biggest I had ever seen, was peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had went all this way expecting to find a real person. But it was only a tape recorder. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady steps advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying rocks and trees I identified as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't try listening to see if that person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home and nothing else. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran into my house, locking the door and shutting all of the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out through them as discreetly as I could to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by that window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge out of the forest's shadows. But nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I also never was able to go back into that forest again. A few months back, my girlfriend and I were bored hanging around the house and spontaneously decided to go out for a hike. We don't go hiking often, but the idea appealed to both of us, and even though there was only about an hour left of light, we figured we had enough time to go enjoy a hike before it got too dark. We quickly fill up our water bottles and put on the best walking shoes we had, and we were out the door, driving up into the mountains. Around my area, there are many hiking trails, with the variety of trails increasing as you go up into the mountains. We tended to stay around the base of the mountains in the occasional case of us hiking, where most people would still be walking, but we wanted to change things up and progressed further up the mountain road to a trail a friend of mine had mentioned. We kept in mind our time and figured that we could hike for a bit and simply enjoy the new environment for us and finish up before it was too late. We arrived at the trailhead and see that there were no cars left along the road where the trail commences, but didn't think much of it due to the time. We still had a good 45 minutes until dark, so we continued on. We start walking down a fairly steep hill that then recoups the elevation at the bottom with an equally steep hill that you have to ascend. We reach the top and then it's smooth sailing from there. We see a lone coyote off of the trail a ways off and some rabbits, and I made a quip about how those rabbits might need to be careful with that coyote lurking around. She playfully hit me for that one. Approximately less than a mile into the trail, we see a large fallen tree that made a bridge over a dried riverbed and decided to take a rest, climb around on it, and take pictures. We're there for about 10 minutes and then resume hiking. We continue on the trail for a short distance until she hears a rustle in the trees behind us. We stop, mildly spooked due to the assumed size of whatever made that rustling, but continue on only briefly before she decides she's done and that we need to head back. It's twilight now, so I agree with her and we turn around to head back to the car. When we made it back to the fallen tree, my shoe had come untied, so I used the trunk to fix my loose laces and look behind us for the first time on the hike. Uncharacteristic for me, but hey, I was having fun, why be paranoid? I see a person dressed entirely in black with their hood on that was a significant distance behind us, walking at a slow, even pace. It wasn't something out of the ordinary, so what if they're wearing black with their hood on? I wear black most of the time and it's cold out. I shouldn't make assumptions. This does trigger me to be more alert, however, and I inform my girlfriend of this person's presence. It's now dusk. We continue on at an intentionally faster pace and go through a winding section of the trail, and I lose sight of the person. When we come around the final bend of the section, I figure they're far behind us and that there's nothing to worry about. Sooner than later, the person is behind us again, but much closer. Probably 50 feet in comparison to 100 feet before, and we had increased our speed, so this alarmed us. We briskly walk around another bend, and as soon as we come around it, we book it. It seemed to be a natural reaction on both of our parts, as we just started running without a word said to initiate it. We are nearing the trailhead now, with only the hills to deal with. We catch our breaths for a moment and I turn around again. I see the person seemingly halt a sprint upon noticing me looking back, as if they were trying to uphold the illusion of simply walking. At this point I shout, "Go!" and we sprint down the hill. What little light was left struggled to make its way through the dense trees surrounding us, and the steep hill proved challenging to run down without a clear path to be seen. We both stumble down the hill, almost falling multiple times and slamming our feet onto rocks and loose brush, but we didn't fall and we didn't look behind us. We make it to the bottom but must continue up the initial hill, and then we will have made it out. We persevere up the incline and make it back to our car. I briefly breathe in relief as I start my car, heart pounding and adrenaline racing. As I reverse onto the road, the person emerges at the trailhead, apparently breathing heavily. We finally get a glimpse of him. His hood had fallen off of his head, exposing his pale complexion and dead eyes that were only illuminated by a single lantern at the start of the trail. He was holding something in his hand, but it was too dark to see, and I was not interested in sticking around to make out the object. I shift into drive and accelerate as fast as my car could muster, leaving him behind in the dust of the empty side of the road. So when I was in elementary school, one of the boys a few grades ahead of me was Kyle Dubé. I was 2 or 3 grades below him, so I didn't have much contact with him outside of recess. In the 4-square line, he often made it a point to stand right behind me and yank on my pigtails as hard as he could, whipping them around under the pretense that I was a horse and he was riding me. He also used to bring knives to school and would sometimes threaten some of his classmates with them when they did something to make them angry, and at one point actually pulled one on a girl, after school, out behind the school. Why nothing was officially done about it, I don't know, but my school, being very small, was not known for being on top of the disciplinary side of things. There were a number of small things, the hair pulling and just the general way he acted, that lead to my being uncomfortable whenever he was around. I wasn't alone in this regard. Former classmates have also expressed feeling uneasy in his presence. To my relief, he ended up moving away, and none of us heard anything from or about him for a number of years. Until one day he shows up on the local news, having been arrested for the murder of Nicole Cable. He made a fake Facebook profile, lured her out of her house, kidnapped her, duct taped her, and left her in the back of his dad's pickup truck. His intention was to pretend to find her and be the hero. When he went back and found that she was dead, he dumped her body in the woods and covered it in sticks. They found her about a week later. I was in school when I read the article, and I had to go to the nurse's office because I felt so weak, sick, and shaky. It's very disconcerting to think a murderer used to yank on my hair. He's going on trial in the next couple of days, which is what made me think of it. It was Sunday afternoon, and my boyfriend and I had just got home from a weekend camping trip. We unpacked quickly, and he went to shower right away before he had to leave for work. I anxiously kept unpacking everything and hated the fact that I would be alone in the house until around 11 p.m. when he got back home. Our house is old, creepy, and kind of secluded. After he left, it was my turn to shower. I always made sure to shower when it was light outside so I wouldn't be as paranoid about every noise. I got out of the shower, wrapped my hair in a towel, and threw my housecoat on. Laying on my bed playing on my phone, I heard the front door handle jiggling loudly. I waited for a moment and heard front door jiggle more aggressively. Feeling irritated, I immediately assumed my boyfriend forgot his work keys, house keys, or phone and had to turn back, meaning he'd be late for work. I got off the bed annoyed and went to open the door for him. When I got to the door, I saw a strange man staring back at me through the door window. He was holding the door handle and turning it. We made eye contact and his eyes went wide. He took off running, and I ran to the back door to make sure it was locked. I grabbed my phone and frantically checked every window to see if the man ran to the backyard. We don't have any fences and live in a wooded area. I couldn't see him or find him. At the time, I didn't know if he came because he knew I was home alone, or if he had been watching the house and saw that it had been empty the past few days. Either way, I grabbed my car keys, scooped up the dog, and got the F out of there. Let me start off by saying that this is not my tale. Believe whatever you want, but I know my dad wouldn't make this up. This is a story my dad has told and retold several times throughout the years. It's as creepy now as it was the first time I heard it. So here it goes. It was the early 1970s in Des Plaines, Illinois. Back then, it was not uncommon to hitchhike. My dad and my uncle, his younger brother, enjoyed doing this, as they were quite the adventurers. They were both pretty young, in their early teens. They had just gone fishing when they had made their way to a nearby coffee shop parking lot in search of a ride to get close to home. A middle-aged man stopped to pick them up. There was nothing really striking about this guy. He just looked like a typical guy, so they got into the car with him. My dad sat in the passenger seat, while my uncle sat in the middle back seat. Everything was fine until the driver reached his arm towards the back of the car and put his hand on my uncle's knee. My dad's creepometer sounded right away, and as soon as they came to a stoplight, my dad got out of the car, took his brother by the arm, and got the hell out of there. Fast forward a few years. It's 1978, and my dad catches a glimpse of a familiar face in the Chicago newspaper. It's the man who had picked them up a few years back. The article states that this man was arrested after police found 33 teenage males buried in various parts of his home, including the crawl space. This sick man would find teenage boys wherever he could, to rape, torture, and kill. His name was John Wayne Gacy. Needless to say, I am happy my dad reacted as quickly as he did. My dad and uncle were the right age to be one of his victims. It's scary to think of what could have happened, and how I wouldn't be here today. So Gacy, even though you are dead now, I am so thankful you and my dad never got to really meet. A few years ago, I was watching a movie at my mom's place, who at the time she was staying on site at an animal rescue. The rescue was a house on a couple acres that had been converted into a rescue. The house itself more or less functioned as a normal home, with the exception of a few rooms that had been converted into kitten nurseries or to keep hutches in, but the backyard crisscrossed with pens for the rescue animals. There were surrounding properties, but it was kilometers away from the nearest station and very difficult to reach without a car. It was about 9 p.m. post-dinner, and all manner of creatures were sleeping soundly in their beds. Most notably, 2 dingo ex-healer dogs. These 2 dogs belonged to the owner and had the run of the property, sleeping on kennels on the veranda. They were little darlings once you got to know them, but quite intimidating when you first met, growls and all. Opening onto that same veranda was a laundry that functioned as a second kitchen. As this laundry opened from the backyard, the rescue staff kept the food, dishes, and utensils for the animals' meals in the laundry, rather than tracking muck through the house on their way to the kitchen. Anyway, we were watching the movie on my laptop, about 20 minutes into You're Next, when someone knocked at the front door. My mom immediately told me not to answer it, but when I asked why, she had no explanation. My mom has pretty great intuition, but since the dogs weren't going off, I answered anyway. I swung open the wood panel door but left the fly screen locked as a concession to her. A soft male voice came out of the dark. The porch light apparently needed replacing. I could make out his height, ~5'9", body shape, thin as heck, a beard, and not much else. He asked for someone whose name I'd never heard. When I told him there was no one here by that name, he said he was waiting for a taxi. But then he said he needed a taxi and asked to come inside to call one. His speech was meandering. By this time, my mom had joined me by the door, pointing at the window. The door was one of those single panels with glass windows from door to ceiling beside it. As we had the lights on inside and it was pitch black night outside, we couldn't see the caller. But he had had all the time in the world to see us. Worried, she gave the caller directions to a payphone down the street. The caller insisted he needed to come inside to call a taxi. I insisted he use the payphone instead. He became quite angry and demanded we let him in. Afraid about being the only ones home that evening, my mom finally snapped and told him she'd call the police if he didn't go away, already dialing 00000 on her mobile. Eventually he stopped arguing, and the prolonged silence suggested he was gone. Not wanting to return to the couch, which was in full view of the door's glass windows, as well as from the veranda, the back wall was floor-to-ceiling glass panels. We occupied our time in the kitchen waiting. We heard another knock on the door. Nervous, we peered through the glass until we could make out blue and red flashing lights. We opened the door to 2 officers and started relaying the story. Suddenly, the officer closest to the door asked, "Is this yours?" We peered around the door frame. A knife lay on the windowsill, a knife my mother immediately recognized as being used for the rescue animals' meal prep. The officers said the description reminded them of a local homeless man who was known for drinking far too much and sleeping it off in people's sheds. As such, they were quick to dismiss it as a serious threat. But afterwards, my mother and I kept making creepy realizations. That knife came from the laundry in the backyard. How did this stranger get it without setting off the dogs? Without setting off any of the rescue animals? How long had he been hanging around in the backyard, getting to know the animals? Had he been watching us too? What exactly did he plan to do with that knife if we had opened the door? I don't really want to know. This is my first story. By the way, English isn't my mother tongue, so sorry if I make any mistake. This happened to me 2 weeks ago. I started university in September and therefore live in a students-only apartment complex. There are 4 other apartments in my hallway, and sometimes we just spend time in each other's apartments. I had the absolute chance, that's ironic, to lose my keys the first week of university. It wasn't a big deal. I simply paid for another key. After a week in my apartment, I started to notice that some of my stuff wasn't in the same place as I thought I'd put it. It didn't scare me because I know I'm a distracted person. On the day of the incident, I was coming home earlier than usual with another student, Thomas, the boy that lives in the apartment next to mine. We got in, and when I unlocked my door, I saw a woman inside my apartment. Of course, it scared me, but as I was about to ask her what the fuck she was doing here, she told me, "Oh, sorry, I didn't know you'd be home this early. I'm the janitor. I clean rooms weekly." She then smiled at me and went out. I didn't know we had a janitor, but this kind of explained why my stuff was moving. Thomas then noticed she had left her keys on my desk and said I should give them back to her. When I took a closer look, I just realized those were my lost keys. The night passed, and I decided to talk to the man in charge of the complex about this. I told him that the janitor that had my lost keys, so I didn't really lost them, and I asked for my money back. He just looked at me in total incomprehension and told me, But we don't even have a janitor. I just froze. Then who the fuck went in my apartment for the past few weeks? Why was she there? We didn't call the police because nothing had been stolen, but I still searched for cameras in my apartment. You never know with these psychopaths. I haven't seen her since that, and I'm glad to know that she can't enter the complex anymore without the badge on the keys. Morals of the story: try not to lose your keys, guys.